Welcome back to Grieving with Grace. In the last video, we opened the door. We acknowledged that grief doesn't just affect one part of us. It moves through our entire system. Spirit, body, brain, relationships, memory, meaning. It doesn't come in stages like a staircase in the way that most people tend to think about grief when they think of the stages of grief from Kubler-Ross. And we'll talk about why that's a good start, but probably not the most accurate understanding at this point. Grief comes in waves and spirals and in mazes and labyrinths. We also talked about how Catholic grief isn't only spiritual or only psychological, it's both. It's incarnate. It lives in our theology, in our nervous system, and in our cells, in our very body. So now we go a little deeper. In this module, we'll ask, what is grief really? Not just what it feels like, but what it actually is. What's happening inside your body when grief takes hold? Why does it hurt in the way that it does? And how can understanding these patterns give some traction, not to fix it, but to name it? We'll look at how grief operates biologically, what role attachment and bonding play, and why it sometimes feels like your whole system is in chaos. We'll also explore how culture shapes grief, how what's expected of you or not acknowledged in you impacts how you carry the weight of loss. You might be surprised by how much has changed in how we grieve over just a few generations, or even our understanding of grief. We'll also name some of the most common myths about grief that, if not understood as myths, can actually make it harder to heal. And if you're going through this with a small group, there's a grief myths icebreaker activity that goes along with this section. You'll see a prompt in the video to pause and circle back later. And while this course will cover many different types of grief, today's focus is especially on death-related loss, the experience of losing someone you love in this life. It may have been recent, it may have been years ago. Either way, what you're feeling is real and it has reasons. This isn't about quick answers or easy encouragement, simple platitudes. This is about giving you language, context, and compassion, so you can begin to see the shape of what you're actually walking through. And as a reminder, all these videos are free to access, but if you'd like to go further, there is a low-cost Grieving with Grace handbook available in the script. There's a link in the description below. It offers printed reflections, guided journal prompts, scripture, saint quotes, and weekly tools for healing. It also includes notes from all of the videos, so you don't have to jot down all of the things and remember them. If you're hoping to start a small group, either at your parish or with friends, there's also a full leader and participant guide pack available with printable handouts, lesson outlines, prayer group suggestions, and even a sign-up flyer. I tried to make it as simple as possible, so being a leader just means you show up and create the space and then read simply from the leader notes. And then you can watch the videos together, so don't worry, you won't be teaching any of the material. You can find both of those links in the description. So let's begin. What is grief really? What grief isn't? 10 myths that make it harder to heal. We're going to begin today not with definitions, but with debunking, because a lot of what we believe about grief is actually not true. It's inherited, picked up, reinforced by culture, maybe by well-meaning people, sometimes even church communities who haven't been given better tools or information. So before we explore what grief is, let's talk about what it isn't. Here are 10 common myths that can actually complicate the healing process. Myth number 1. Grief comes in stages. First denial, then anger, then acceptance. This idea comes from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work in 1969, but she was studying the emotional experience of people facing their own death, not grieving others. Real-life grief is not linear. Emotions don't arrive in an order. They loop and spike and stall and repeat. Grief isn't a staircase, it's a wave pattern. And you may feel acceptance one day and be slammed with disbelief the next. And all of that is normal. Myth 2. Time heals all wounds. Time helps, yes, but time itself doesn't process anything. Unacknowledged or unprocessed grief doesn't go away. It just gets pushed underground where it can affect our health, our relationships, and even our spiritual life. So when we experience a grief, we're experiencing the grief in front of us, but it also opens the door to any unresolved griefs in the past. I once worked with a Vietnam War vet who had experienced the grief of his buddies, but he was fine. Tragically, the grief of his son passing, but he was fine. And then his wife passed, and he was fine. And then one day, sadly, his cat died, and he was not fine. Grief came rushing in like a tidal wave, and he felt absolutely crazy. And that's when we met. And I was able to reassure him that, yes, you are grieving your dear cat, your pet who's very special to you. But only now has your psyche felt safe enough to be able to unpack all of those unresolved griefs from the past. Myth 3. If you're still grieving after a year, something is wrong. There is no universal timeline for grief. This 1 year figure that we hear, I think comes from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's what we use to diagnose psychiatric conditions or mental health disorders, where it said after a year, if someone is still in profound grief, we called it prolonged or complicated grief. And it's not how it's defined anymore. But if you hear that 1 year, that's probably where it comes from. In fact, research shows that acute grief often lasts longer than a year, especially in the case of child loss, traumatic death, or disenfranchised grief. Grief is not pathological just because it lingers. Suffering doesn't follow a calendar. And sometimes it can be the second year after a death that is the hardest. Because at first, everyone's present. It's the first holiday, the first Christmas, the first birthday. People are calling and thinking of you. But the second year, people start forgetting to check in, and then you're alone, and then it's real. So that can happen too. Myth 4. You should be strong for others. This one runs deep, especially in cultures where crying is equated with weakness or a lack of self-control. We see this a lot in Western cultures, or the famous British stiff upper lip. But research on emotional expression shows that suppressing grief actually increases psychological and physiological distress and worsens adjustment over time. Strength isn't about silence, it's about presence. That doesn't mean that you have to wail in front of your entire family, friends, and co-workers if you don't feel comfortable. But if you don't in that environment, it's still important to give yourself time to cry and to grieve as you need to, whatever those strong emotions may look like. Myth 5. Faithful Catholics don't grieve as much because we believe in heaven. This one's hard and it can hurt, because while we do believe in the resurrection, we still love in the here and now. Maybe our loved one is outside of time, but we're still in it. And even Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus. Saints grieved, Mary grieved. Heaven doesn't erase sorrow, it transforms it. And we can hold both hope and heartbreak at the same time. So much of experiencing positive mental health, whether it's in grief or anything else, is about being able to hold seemingly opposites at the same time. To be sad and mad. To be hopeful and grief-filled. Myth number 6. If you're laughing, you must be okay. Grievers often feel guilty when they smile or enjoy something again, but humor, distraction, temporary lightness are all adaptive. They give the nervous system a break. It can be part of the brain's natural shutoff. In fact, in pain theory, we have something called the pain gate theory, where our brain can only process a certain level of pain, and then they kind of stop or shut off. The dual process model of grief shows that oscillation going back and forth between sorrow and restoration is actually a sign of resilience. Myth 7. Grief means crying all the time. Not everyone cries. Some go numb. Some throw themselves into work. Some clean the garage or go silent. Some people get angry or irritable. These are all normal variations. In fact, men and women often grieve differently. And attachment style, temperament, and trauma history all affect our expression of grief. And in fact, one of the things that can be protective to a marriage after the loss of a child is helping the couples give space for the other spouse to grieve in a way that looks very different without judging that or giving a meaning that it means somehow they care less or are moving on faster. Myth 8. If you weren't that close to a person, your grief shouldn't be that intense. Grief is not determined solely by proximity or title. Sometimes we grieve what that relationship represented: a lost chance, an unmet need, a symbolic hope. We see this a lot when people who've never met a public figure have strong expressions of grief, even if they've never met that person. Think of the footage when Princess Diana died, or the Queen, and people who had never met them had very strong, very real expressions of grief. Other times it's the context of the loss or what it stirs up from the past. Pain is personal, and it's not always explainable in words, and that's okay. Myth number 9. You should avoid talking about it to keep from upsetting people. Silence may feel safer, but suppressing grief can increase the risk for complicated or prolonged grief later on. Talking doesn't prolong pain, it actually helps metabolize it. Even brief, compassionate conversations can reduce isolation and normalize your experience. I love parts of the Jewish tradition of Shiva or Shiva after someone dies, where the windows are covered and the mirrors are covered, and the only thing you talk about for a certain number of days is the life of that person. People come over for the purpose of crying together and talking together, and it can be very, very helpful. Imagine in our society if instead of your girlfriend coming over with a pint of Bluebell ice cream to help you feel better, she came over with a box of tissues and a MP3 player with sad music so that y'all could cry together. Myth number 10. The goal of grief is to move on. This one can be the most harmful. In fact, as a therapist, I never use the word move on with clients in grief. Anyone who's ever grieved someone they really love knows that nobody moves on. The goal is to move with, to move through, to integrate the life of that person in a new way. Grief isn't something we get over. It's something we learn to live with and integrate. We carry it differently. We have a different relationship to the grief and to the person. Healthy grieving means maintaining a continued bond while adapting to new realities. We move forward, not on. And you don't have to memorize any of this. Just notice if one of these myths is something you've internalized, if you've judged your own grief or maybe someone else's because it didn't follow these rules. Those rules were never true to begin with. So now that we've cleared the ground, we can start to build a more accurate and compassionate understanding of what grief really is. When you're ready, let's go deeper into what's actually happening in the mind, body, and spirit when we experience loss. And with that said, I should take a moment to remind you that these videos, these lessons can be very intense. And if you need to pause and come back and give yourself some time, please feel free to do that. They will always be here. What research reveals about loss, love, and resilience. Before we talk about what grief feels like, let's spend a moment on what grief shows us, because research gives us some powerful insights into how deeply grief affects us, how common it is, and what really helps people make it through. These aren't here to minimize what you're feeling or the uniqueness and individuality of your loss. They're here to help you normalize it, to show you that what you're feeling or going through is part of a universal human experience that crosses time, culture, and belief. Grief is universal and yet often isolated. So let's start with some basics. 100% of people will experience specific grief in their lifetime. And this isn't just a philosophical expression. There's actually a study that showed this. It's not an if, but when. And we can thank Dr. Bonanno in 2009 for putting some data to this universal truth. In the US, over 2.8 million people die each year, leaving behind on average 5 close bereaved individuals per death. That's 14 million people navigating fresh grief each year. And yet 60% of grieving people say they feel misunderstood or emotionally isolated after the loss. More than half of Americans say they avoid talking about death entirely. If you're in the US, we live in a world, in a culture where one, loss is certain, but conversation about grief and death is shockingly rare. Number 2, the risks after loss are real, but they're not inevitable. Grief doesn't just affect emotions. It impacts the entire person: brain, body, behavior, relationships. Bereaved spouses have a 66% higher risk of death in the first 3 months after their partner's passing. This is known as the widowhood effect. And men tend to fare worse than women. We don't exactly know why it is, but we think part of it is that women tend to be better at utilizing and engaging in social supports than men do. Grief can suppress immune function, increase inflammation, raise blood pressure, and contribute to cardiac events. Bereaved parents are at a higher risk of depression, anxiety, PTSD, and marital strain. But not all marriages end in divorce, contrary to a popular myth. Number 3, after the death of a child, the relationship myth. You may have heard the phrase, most marriages don't survive the loss of a child, but that's a myth, and research doesn't back it up. A large-scale study of over 1.5 million parents found that the divorce rate among bereaved parents was not significantly higher than those who had not lost a child. This is Murphy et al., 2003. And if you get the handbook, I'll be sure and leave the link there. However, marital satisfaction can suffer if partners grieve differently, if they don't feel supported or avoid communication. So what helps? I love helping couples and family in this space. When I was an undergrad, I did an internship at Beau's Place in Houston, which was started by the Bushes after the loss of their daughter, and it helped family after the loss of a parent or sibling. Here's some things I learned. Things that can be helpful: shared rituals of remembrance, open conversations even if they're painful, support groups for bereaved parents and children like Beau's Place, spiritual and faith-based counseling, permission for different grieving styles. Some people need to talk, others need to work, others need space. Some just need to listen to others, which is why if you're in a small group, I'm so glad that you're here, but it's really important that we respect everybody's preferences when it comes to sharing and talking. It's not true that you have to talk about it. You have to process it, but that can look very different for different people. The relationships that survive and strengthen after child loss are the ones where both partners feel seen, heard, and not blamed for grieving in a wrong way. So what actually helps people heal? It's not the platitudes. It's not rushing back to work. It's not getting over it. Here's what the research shows does help grieving people heal. Compassionate social support, like feeling emotionally safe when even one person just gets it. We know that not everybody who loves you has the emotional capacity of their own to sit with your grief. So it's important to think of it like a Venn diagram with all the people who love you in your life and all the people who have the capacity to sit with grief and to find that intersection. Meaning making can help, like finding purpose, legacy, or spiritual growth. And this can take time. Rituals and remembrance, especially faith-based or cultural rituals. As Catholics, we do this fantastically. Naming the loss, like journaling, prayer, counseling, storytelling. And then somatic and nervous system support. This is often missed. Somatic means the body, the soma, like grounding movement and breath work. And I'm not talking about Eastern practices that are contrary to our faith, or if you're uncomfortable with things like yoga, there's still things that you can do that are perfectly consistent with our faith. Remember, our Catholic faith has a beautiful theology of the body. But this body work, this nervous system support, is especially especially important when the grief is traumatic or chronic. And we'll talk more about this in a later module. But just know this isn't a checklist. It's a reminder that you're not powerless. Grief is real and it changes us, but it also reveals us. Our love, our values, our faith, our resilience. I like to think that when people die, they leave a gift, but it's up to us to find the gift. And when some days feel unbearable, just know that your nervous system can heal. Your relationships can grow stronger. Your soul is not alone. We grieve because we love, and that love, even when it's aching, is part of what makes us feel alive. If grief is the price we pay for love, it's also love with nowhere to land. Grief is a learning process, not a linear stage. Okay, so let's go back to what we talked about in one of the myths, that you may have heard that grief comes in 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. That framework comes from Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. But what many people don't know is that she developed this model in the 1960s to describe how terminally ill patients come to terms with their own death. It's a wonderful model. It's a great first step, but we have to understand it for what it is. It was never meant to be a universal roadmap for everyone mourning loss. Even Kubler-Ross herself later clarified this in her co-authored work on Grief and Grieving, stating clearly that grief doesn't follow a neat progression, and people don't move through stages in any kind of an order. Yet that 5 stages idea has stuck. Why? Because as humans, we like clear categories, or to be more accurate, our brains like clear categories. We want timelines. We want to know how long this will last, what comes next, and if we're doing it right. But grief doesn't work like that, because love doesn't work like that. So what does the research say now? What is a better way of thinking about grief? Well, contemporary psychology favors a more flexible model called the dual process model of grief, which was described by Strobe and Schutt in 1999 and then again in a work in 2010. This model shows that grieving people move back and forth between 2 modes: loss-oriented tasks like feeling pain, yearning, crying, remembering, confronting the absence, and restoration-oriented tasks like adapting to life, problem-solving, trying to build a new normal, making meaning. And here's the important part. Healthy grieving moves in oscillation, which means back and forth, a back and forth rhythm, not moving on in one linear way. You may have a day where you're in tears, you miss the loved one deeply. Then the next, you're able to do laundry and laugh at something on TV. It doesn't mean you're over it. It means that you're human. So what's actually happening in the brain when we grieve? And don't lose me here. I will keep this light, but I do think that understanding what's happening in our brain can be very helpful. So neuroscience, or the science of how our brain works, has added something incredibly helpful here. Mary Frances O'Connor in 2022 wrote a groundbreaking book called The Grieving Brain. And she explains that grief is not just an emotion, it's actually a cognitive learning process. Cognitive means thinking. So it's a learning process. And what that means is grief is your brain trying to update its internal map of the world. So our brains have maps. They know where to find things. They know if I wanted to reach my loved one, how would I get there? How long would it take me if I picked up the phone? When could I hear their voice? And it has to update this internal map now. A map where your loved one used to exist physically, but now doesn't. And the hard truth is your brain doesn't immediately know that they're gone. So even when you know cognitively or logically that they've died, your brain's reward center and attachment systems, the part of our brains that are deeper and more emotional and don't speak a language, still expect them to walk through the door, to answer your text, or to be in the room where you've left them. And this happens subconsciously. We're not thinking about it logically. So if you've ever had that experience, that's why. That's why so many grieving people have experiences like reaching for the phone to call someone who's passed, or seeing them in a crowd for a split second, or hearing their voice when you're half asleep. Or it's not irrational. It's not a sign that something's wrong. It doesn't mean you're going crazy. It's your brain doing exactly what it's designed to do, to track people you love in this internal map. So grief is not forgetting. Grief is actually relearning the truth of absence. It's learning how to love when the relationship has changed. And again, as Catholics, this is where our faith fits beautifully. Love is not the end. The only thing stronger than death is love. We have the communion of saints. So our relationship changes. It's not ended. So think about what this means spiritually. In Romans 12:2, St. Paul writes, "Do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may discern what the will of God is, and what is good and acceptable and perfect." Grief, in a sense, is a renewing of the mind, but not in a tidy theological way. It's often messy and painful and slow, but spiritually, we believe that transformation is possible, even in suffering. Grief changes your neural pathways, yes, or those internal brain maps, yes, but it also transforms your heart, your capacity to empathize, your depth of prayer, your awareness of what matters. In John Paul II's encyclical on the Christian meaning of human suffering, he asks the question of why, and ultimately he comes to the answer that the why of suffering, that it is allowed, is to unleash love. And think about it, when we really connect with other people, it's really not in our strengths. It's in our wounds, in our cracks, in our aches. It can be nice to share that we were both blue ribbon 4-H'ers, but when we really connect, it's, oh, I broke my arm too once, and I remember what that was like. Suffering has the capacity to unleash love. So just know that you're not going crazy if you've experienced any of these things. It's not faithless just because you miss them. You're not weak because your grief reactivates unexpectedly. You're a human being learning how to carry love in a new form. Your brain is literally catching up in learning, and that's not a spiritual deficit. So if you're wondering, why does it still hurt? Why do I feel okay one minute and then fall apart the next? Why can't I just accept this and move on? Just know that there's nothing wrong with the questions, and there's nothing wrong that you don't have answers. This is what real grieving looks like, and that's what love does. Cultural shifts in the changing face of grief. Grief is a universal human experience, but the way that we grieve, what we expect of mourners, and how we respond to loss has changed dramatically across cultures and time periods. So in this section, we'll explore how grief practices have evolved and how some modern shifts may be helping or hurting our ability to process loss well. Grief was once communal, embodied, and public. Historically, grief was shared in community. In many traditional societies, grief included structural rituals, mourning clothing, and public expressions of lament, like black veils, extended wakes. People were given a set role and a socially accepted space to be undone for a time. In the 19th and early 20th century America, mourning periods were codified, especially for widows who wore black for a whole year. Some cultural examples are that in many Jewish traditions, we talked about sitting Shiva, a home-based period where friends and family would bring food, sit together, and listen without giving advice. In Mexican cultures, there's in other parts of Latin America, embraces Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, as a time of celebration, memory, and storytelling, connecting the living with deceased loved ones. And in many African cultures, public wailing expected and understood to be part of collective grief. Grief is performed together in a sense, not hidden alone. And of course, as Catholics, we also have beautiful rituals in our faith. Modern grief, faster, quieter, more private. Today, especially in the West and in American context, I say this specifically because I know that we have people who watch from over 100 countries. Bereavement leave is often limited to 3 to 5 days, as though one can process a life-altering loss in less than a week. The cultural script seems to say, move on, I'll be strong, let's go. Produce, produce, produce. Emotional expressions of grief are often misunderstood or pathologized, especially if they extend past a few months. Grieving people often feel pressure to hide their pain and to get back to normal quickly, especially at work or in church. Grieving well or doing well generally means in the US that there are no visible displays of emotion. This shift is sometimes referred to as the medicalization of grief. Grief becomes something to manage, not to accompany. On social media, double-edged sword. Some people find that sharing publicly, like memorial posts, anniversary tributes, or symbolic photos, can create a sense of ongoing connection. Others feel isolated by the curated perfection of online life. In some cases, social media can trivialize grief into likes and attention without the depth of presence true requires. In families who feel differently about different things being shared, it can create issues. I know in our own family, when someone very special died, one person in the family who was much younger posted a picture of a loved one in their casket with the casket open on their social media page. And it was something they felt was connecting, but it actually offended and felt very improper to other members of the family. So those are some ways that we have to negotiate these things. The impact of these cultural shifts. Many people feel alone in grief, even when surrounded by others. Without rituals or a shared language, grievers can feel unsure of how to process or express loss. As Americans, we have become very separate from grief. Even now, in Italy, in parts of Italy, it's the family themselves, usually the father, who will hammer the final nails into the coffin or the casket. And in the US, we tend to have a very hands-off view and leave that to the funeral home. It's not that one is better than the other. I just think it's important to recognize that it hasn't always been this way. Also in Italy, there's less urgency or less desire for the person in the casket to appear as if they are alive. The natural blueness to the lips or the loss of color in the face is not as readily covered as it is in the US. Funeral homes or morticians want the body to look alive, but sleeping. And again, I'm not making a moral judgment on any of this, just something to think about. Emotional suppression, which is common in Western grief, is linked to higher rates of complicated grief, depression, and even physical illness. What the church offers instead. In contrast, our Catholic tradition gives us a sacred framework. Funeral masses, the prayers for the dead, the commemoration of all souls, the corporal works of mercy to bury the dead all reminds us that grief is not private. The death are not forgotten. Mourning is not a weakness, but a participation in love. In fact, in November, we have a whole period in our church year where we remember last things, where we remember the dead. And in the communion of saints, we are not separated forever. As Pope Benedict XVI once said, we live in communion, not only with the saints of heaven, but also with our loved ones who have died and are in purifying expectation. How grief has changed over time. Grief hasn't always looked like this, silent, solitary, and squeezed into a weekend. In fact, for most of human history, grief was public and prolonged and deeply ritualized, as we just spoke about. Mourning was something that people could see. Black clothes, funeral processions, empty seats in church, friends bringing food for weeks, whole communities acknowledging your loss, not just for a day, but for a year or more. And at some point, even the color of the stole that the priest wears during a funeral mass went from black to white. And again, I'm not saying that that's wrong. I just want us to have a larger picture to understand that what we see today, right now, what's expected of us right now is not the only way that it's always been. There were expectations not to move on, but to move through, to wail, to wear mourning veils, to take time off work, to have a funeral in your home, to let your home be filled with the scent of lilies, the sounds of prayer, the presence of people gathered, and the ache of absence. In different countries, even in the Western countries, there are places where it is expected that the body of the deceased would remain in the home for a few days until the first signs of decomposition was seen, and only then would they be moved to a funeral home or a mortuary. It's a very different view. In many ways, these cultures who do that help with this relearning process, because there's this period of time that we're physically seeing some of the beginning changes of our loved one to help remap that internal map. And for others, people may say, absolutely not. That would be horrifying to me. And that's fine too. Again, I'm just trying to give a wider scope of how to understand grief and to see how people around the world grieve, because again, grief is often something hidden and not talked about. Today, things are different. Our cultures move fast, and so people often expect you to move fast. You get a few days off, a funeral, maybe a few texts, and then silence. People stop asking, and you start wondering if you're doing something wrong because you're still sad and still aching and still waking up in tears, forgetting like you know how to breathe in the middle of the day. But you're not doing anything wrong. What's changed is not the pain, it's the permission. In 2022, the American Psychiatric Association added prolonged grief disorder to the DSM-5-TR. This is the diagnostic and statistical manual that holds all of our diagnosis and tells us what has to happen for someone to have a diagnosis. This is a diagnostic category describing intense grief that persists beyond a year and interferes with functioning. In some cases, this recognition can be helpful, especially when someone is truly stuck. But many grief therapists also caution that this medicalization of sorrow can make people feel pathologized simply for loving deeply. There are some grief therapists, psychologists, and researchers who believe that prolonged grief disorder should be more about the movement or progress of the grief slowing or stopping, not that someone has finished the process or not finished the process. At the same time, grief has become increasingly mediated through. So there's no easy answers, and here's what we know. Grief has always existed, but the rules and expectations around it have changed dramatically. Yet our Catholic faith has not stopped holding space for grief. Our liturgical calendar includes All Souls Day, funeral rites, memorial masses, and the Church has never been afraid of mourning. In fact, it's a work of mercy to bury the dead. The Catechism in paragraphs 1681 to 1690 outlines the Church's approach to death and grief, reminding us that while we are people of the resurrection, we also dwell in a world that weeps. But many Catholics today don't know how to access these traditions. They don't know that it's okay to sit with sorrow, to light candles long after the funeral, to pray with photos, to ask the saints to intercede for their healing. They don't know that grief has seasons and that the Church still honors these seasons. So part of this course is a reclaiming, a reteaching of the rhythms that we were never meant to lose. What grief looks like in the mind, body, and spirit. Grief doesn't just live in your emotions. Remember, it takes up residence in your body and your brain, your sleep, appetite, prayer life, and sometimes even in the sense of who you are. So let's break that down. In the body, If you've ever thought this doesn't feel emotional, it feels physical, you are right. Grief can show up in our body as exhaustion and fatigue that sleep won't fix, chest tightness, or a literal ache in your heart. Of course, because cardiac events can go up after grief. If you ever have a concern, please check in with your doctor. But also headaches and body pain, gut issues, nausea, and changes in digestion, heart palpitations, and elevated blood pressure, sleep disruptions, either insomnia or oversleeping, or early morning waking, and a weakened immune system are all part of how grief can show up in our body. In fact, the anterior cingulate cortex, that part of the brain that's involved in processing physical pain, remember that it's also active during emotional pain. The same part of your brain lights up for emotional pain and physical pain. So when people say it's in your mind or it's in your brain, yes, just like all pain is in your mind. This is especially true with social and attachment-related pain. So that's why heartbreak isn't just a metaphor. Your brain is using the same pathways that light up when you break a bone or get hurt. Your nervous system may interpret the death of a loved one as a survival threat and activate a stress response. You might feel stuck in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, even if the loss happened months ago or years ago. So this doesn't mean that your body's broken. It means it's trying to protect you. In the mind, how does grief show up in the mind? Grief is a cognitive disorder. Some people call that grief fog or mental fog. And there's good neuroscience behind that. You might experience difficulty concentrating or remembering things, disorientation or time distortion, intrusive thoughts or dreams about the person, decision fatigue and mental shutdown, forgetting what you're doing mid-task. This mental fog can last weeks or months, and it is normal. Of course, if you have any questions, please check in with your doctor. But we know that much of this is normal. Your brain is working overtime to update its internal map of the world, trying to reconcile the fact that someone who used to be part of your daily rhythm is no longer physically present. And as Mary Frances O'Connor explains in The Grieving Brain, her wonderful book in 2022, grief is essentially a learning process. Your brain is unlearning one reality and trying to build a new one. But these neural pathways don't shift overnight, especially when those pathways were formed by years of intimacy and habit in a shared life. So if you're experiencing this, it doesn't mean you're failing or doing something wrong. It just means you're in the middle of an invisible kind of learning in the spirit. And then there's the soul. Grief often brings a spiritual disorientation too. You may feel distant from God, experiencing dryness or silence in prayers, questioning your faith, purpose, or beliefs, feeling abandoned or punished, struggling with envy or anger towards others who haven't experienced your loss, worrying you're being ungrateful for grieving too long. And all of this is common. Even the saints went through it. Think of St. Monica's tears for Augustine. Think of Mary at the foot of the cross. Think of Jesus himself. My God, why have you forsaken me? These aren't signs of spiritual weakness. They're moments of honest lament. And our tradition is full of them. Lament is not a betrayal of faith. It's an act of faith in the dark. And in the workbook, I'll be sure and give you a list of psalms of lament that you can pray. In Catholic theology, we don't separate the physical and the spiritual. Lex ordinary, lex credendi. We believe with our bodies. We pray with our bodies. So it makes sense that grief hits us in all of those places too. Think of the beautiful theology of the body. Your grief is not just an emotional process. It's a whole self-experience. And when you start to notice where grief is showing up in your fatigue or forgetfulness, in your prayer, in your gut, doesn't mean something's wrong. It means you're letting yourself feel. And that, my friend, that is where healing starts. So let's look now at the role of attachment in grief. We know where it can show up. We know why it shows up there, but Why does it hurt so dang much? Because love bonds the brain. And when a bond is broken, it doesn't just dissolve quietly. It rips and tears and leaves behind a biological and a spiritual ache. So let's go deeper into what exactly is happening in that brain, body, and soul of yours when a loved one is gone. Remember that attachment is a biological reality. Attachment isn't just a psychological concept or something from a parenting book. It's neurological. When we love someone, whether a parent, child, spouse, sibling, friend, our brain forms what researchers call internal working models of that person. This means that we don't just know them, we are wired around them. Our schedules include them. Our sense of safety includes them. Our joy, our stress relief, our identity includes them. And every time we interact with them, our brain is getting little doses of dopamine and oxytocin and endogenous opioids. These are the natural ones from your brain. These are chemicals that regulate pleasure and bonding and emotion regulation. So when a person is no longer here, these neurochemicals don't just shut off, they crash. Many people in early grief experience symptoms that can mirror a substance withdrawal, like shaking, obsessive thoughts, craving reunion, physical agitation and collapse, a need to check for the person even after death. This, again, does not mean you're going crazy. This is the brain's way of screaming, "Where is my person?" And that screaming isn't metaphorical. It's neurological. Attachment is also emotional. If you are deeply connected with someone emotionally, spiritually, physically, then grief can feel like a full body earthquake. Sometimes people feel ashamed that their grief is so intense. They'll say, "I should be stronger. It's been months. I should move on. We had a complicated relationship, so why do I still feel this broken?" But here's the truth. The depth of your grief is not a reflection of weakness. It's a reflection of your capacity for attachment, which is a gift, even though it hurts. Attachment theory, started by Bowlby in 1980, teaches us that we're biologically wired to seek proximity, safety, and comfort from those we love. And when they're gone, the body-mind system goes into the more secure and emotionally available someone was in your life, the more disoriented your internal world may seem without them. And even in strained or ambivalent relationships, your brain can still be grieving the loss of the hope of resolution or the version of the person you wished they could have been. Grief isn't just about who died, it's also about everything they represented: safety, identity, history, your story. Attachment is also theological. So let's bring this to our Catholic worldview. You were made for communion. And that's not poetic fluff, it's doctrine. God himself is an eternal exchange of love, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and he has us to share in that exchange. Catechism of the Catholic Church 221. You were created in the image of God, who is relationship itself. So when someone you love dies, it makes sense that your body and soul ache, because the Trinitarian God you reflect is a God who never exists alone. This is why grief is not unspiritual. This is why your pain is not a failure of faith. It's the cost of love. And in Catholic theology, the cost is not something to be bypassed, but something Christ embraced himself. Jesus wept. John, the shortest verse in Scripture and perhaps the most profound. Jesus stands outside the tomb of his friend Lazarus, and he doesn't suppress his tears. Even though he knows he will raise Lazarus, even though he knows he is God, even though he is all-powerful, he weeps. Why? Well, theologians have debated over this for centuries, but at least a part of that is because that's what love does in the face of loss. Jesus doesn't fast forward to the miracle. He allows space for the mourning. And if he, in his perfection, gives us permission to weep, not to tear up, not to shed one or two little tears politely, but to weep, then we have it too. Grief is not an absence of faith, it's evidence of love. And love, real love, binds us in ways that leaves traces in the brain, in the body, in our nervous system, in our soul. Traces that don't just disappear when someone dies. Traces that need to be rewired, held, honored, and ultimately transformed. Not erased, not moved on from. The sacredness of grief in Catholic tradition. Let's pause here because for a lot of us, especially as Catholics, grief can feel confusing and paradoxical. We're told that Christ conquered death. We're told that heaven is real. We're told to hope, to rejoice, to believe in the resurrection, and that is all true. And sometimes those truths get misused or weaponized even into subtle messages like, you should be happy there in heaven. Don't be sad. They're with Jesus now. God needed another angel. Why? They wouldn't want you to cry. And what starts off as faith can quickly become emotional repression dressed up as piety. And here's the thing. Our church at her best doesn't say that. She doesn't ask you to pretend that death doesn't hurt or tell you to smile through your tears. She doesn't say mourning is weakness. She asks you to hold both realities at the same time. And this reminds me of that dual process method of grief and oscillating between the sadness and the hope and the resilience. In fact, the Catechism gives us this line, tucked away in paragraph 1681. The Christian meaning of death is revealed in the light of the paschal mystery of the death and resurrection of Christ. In him, Christian death has positive meaning. Now, positive meaning doesn't mean pleasant experience. It means that even in something as devastating as death, God can bring about redemption, the both and. That's a big difference from saying that grief should only feel holy or feel beautiful all the time. It doesn't always feel beautiful. It's messy, loud, silent, shaky, numb. Sometimes it knocks the breath out of you. Jesus wept, not a polite tear, but it was still sacred. Why? Because grief is born of love. And love is always sacred. That means your grief belongs in prayer, in liturgy, in sacred spaces, to the extent that you're comfortable. Not hidden in the bathroom floor or stuffed away into a polite answer in a grocery store. Again, according to your comfort level. Grieving saints, grieving church. If you've ever felt ashamed for struggling with grief, remember the saints wept. St. Monica wept so intensely for her son Augustine that she became known as the Mother of Tears. This wasn't a grief of physical death, but an anticipatory grief of spiritual death and a worry. St. Gianna Molla's husband spoke of her death as a wound that pierced every part of him, and yet he still carried her love forward into his parenting and prayer. St. Edith Stein, who lost her mother and wrote powerfully about the mystery of sorrow, said, "Let us go forward in peace, our eyes upon heaven, the only one goal of our labors." Not one of them was a stranger to loss. Even the Blessed Mother, we call her Our Lady of Sorrows for a reason. Sorrow is a feeling, an emotion. She stood at the foot of the cross and watched her son die. And the church asks us not to rush past that moment, but to honor it, to make space for it, a name for it. Her sorrow, like yours, was not a failure of faith. It was an expression of it. Resurrection does not erase the wounds. I want to remind you of something that I know you already know, but is worth sitting with. When Jesus was raised from the dead, he still had his wounds. They are erased, they're glorified. His resurrected body bears the marks of love, the history of pain, the cost of sacrifice, the story that brought him there. And if that's true for him, it's true for us too. Your grief may not disappear this side of eternity, but it can become something sacred, something honest, real, something that points not just to what's lost, but also how deeply you've loved and how you've been transformed. This is not a detour from your spiritual life. It is your spiritual life right now. Integration and reflection tools. So let's land here for a moment. You've taken in a lot today. Maybe it hit you in the chest, maybe in the throat, maybe somewhere quieter. Maybe you listened in one fell swoop, and good for you if you could do that. Or maybe you had to pause along the way, and all of that's okay. Grief isn't just something we learn about. It's something we live through. So let's make sure that we're not just watching, listening, learning, but also healing. And you don't need a workbook or a small group to start healing. You can start right here with what you already have. So here are a few gentle ways to let what we've talked about sink in, to give it space in your body, mind, and spirit. Take a few quiet minutes, maybe right after this video, maybe pause it and come back and ask yourself, what have I lost that others have seen? What have I lost that no one knows about? What did I not get to say? What still aches the most? You don't need paragraphs. A few raw words scribbled on a note in your phone or a page in your journal or even a sticky note is enough. Let it be messy. Grief. After this video, take a slow walk around your house or outside. And as you walk, simply say the names of the things that you've lost under your breath or in your heart. This is what I miss. This is who I miss. This is what changed. No need to fix anything, just walk with it. And if you'd like some music to accompany you, you can check out our playlist, Melodies for Motherhood. Scriptural meditation, John 11:35. The shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. Sit with it, read it, imagine his face, his tears, his presence. Write your name into that scene. Let yourself be seen in your sorrow. But of course, if you want more structure or if you're in a season where holding your grief needs more support, the Companion Handbook gives you some more space and guidance. And in this module, there'll be a printable grief inventory worksheet, more guided journaling pages, a summary of the dual process model, more Catholic reflections and group questions, along with the Grief Myths Icebreaker for the small group packet. There's a link for them, and we've made the price low so they're accessible to anyone who needs it. But remember, you don't need to do all of this now. But if something resonated, just take a few minutes and mark that on paper, in prayer, in your breath. That is how grief heals, not in a rush, not in a straight line, but with presence. We are praying for you here at the Catholic Counseling Institute. Please share this, like and subscribe. It really does help YouTube know that people are listening and interested in this type of content. Maybe when someone types in grief, it'll come up and you'll be able to share this with them in that way. I'll see you in the next module.